Breakthrough in Failure. A 20-chapter book by Kemi Adebayo, this is a modified true-life story with the names of characters and location changed. Epilogue: A Life Well Lived. Kwame's life was rich with accomplishments, but his greatest pride was in the family he had built and the people he had inspired. As he looked back on his journey, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He had learned that success is not defined by the plans we make, but by how we respond when those plans go awry. Kwame's life was proof that even in the face of failure, it is possible to find success, happiness, and fulfillment. Chapter 1. The Dream of an Engineer. Kwame Mensah sat on the worn leather couch in his family's modest living room, his eyes glued to the television screen. The program, an educational documentary on the world's greatest engineering marvels, captivated him. Kwame had watched this particular episode many times before, but each viewing filled him with the same awe and inspiration. The bridges, skyscrapers, and innovative machines showcased on the screen were more than just structures to Kwame. They were symbols of human ingenuity, the tangible results of curiosity and determination. From a young age, Kwame had been fascinated by how things worked. His mother often found him tinkering with broken radios, old clocks, and anything else he could take apart and attempt to fix. While other children were outside playing football, Kwame spent his time with screwdrivers, pliers, and an insatiable curiosity. It was a passion that his father, Kofi Mensah, a mechanical engineer, recognized and encouraged. Kofi was Kwame's hero. He worked for one of the largest construction firms in Accra, where he was respected not only for his technical skills, but also for his innovative problem-solving abilities. In Kwame's eyes, his father was a genius who could fix anything, build anything, and solve any problem. Kofi's influence was undeniable. It was he who had sparked Kwame's dream of becoming an engineer. Every evening, Kofi would share stories from his workday about the challenges of designing complex systems, the thrill of seeing a project come to life, and the satisfaction of knowing that his work made a tangible difference. These stories were like fuel to Kwame's ambitions. He imagined himself walking in his father's footsteps, solving problems, building great structures, and making his mark on the world. As Kwame progressed through school, his interest in science, particularly physics, grew stronger. He was always eager to learn more about the principles that governed the world around him: forces, energy, and motion. Physics was more than just a subject. It was the key to unlocking the mysteries of the world. Kwame excelled in his studies, often topping his class in science subjects. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue engineering, a career that seemed tailor-made for his talents. By the time Kwame reached his final year of secondary school, his path seemed clear. He would graduate with top marks, gain admission to one of Ghana's prestigious universities, and study electrical engineering. The idea filled him with excitement and a sense of purpose. He saw his future unfolding in front of him, working in top engineering firms, designing and building innovative solutions. And one day, perhaps, becoming as respected and accomplished as his father. Kwame's family shared his enthusiasm. His mother, Afia, always spoke proudly of her son's ambitions, telling relatives and friends that Kwame would soon become an engineer, just like his father. Even his younger siblings looked up to him, already considering him the family's resident engineer, because he was the go-to person whenever something in the house needed fixing. Kwame's father was particularly invested in his son's dream. On weekends, Kofi would bring home technical books and magazines for Kwame to read. They would sit together for hours discussing various engineering topics, from basic mechanics to advanced electrical systems. These sessions were more than just father-son bonding moments. They were like informal tutoring sessions that deepened Kwame's understanding and passion for engineering. Kofi also took Kwame to his work sites whenever possible, giving him a first-hand look at the world of engineering. Kwame loved these visits. The towering cranes, the intricate blueprints, the precision of the work being done, it was all so exciting. He imagined the day when he, too, would don a hard hat, oversee projects, and contribute to the creation of something remarkable. However, beneath Kwame's confidence and excitement was a growing sense of pressure. His entire identity had become intertwined with the idea of becoming an engineer. It wasn't just a career choice, It was the fulfillment of his dreams, his family's expectations, and his father's legacy. The thought of failing to achieve this goal was unimaginable. As the final exams approached, Kwame threw himself into his studies with even greater intensity. Physics, in particular, became the focus of his attention. He knew that his performance in this subject would determine his future. But as he studied late into the night, Kwame couldn't shake the anxiety that gnawed at him. What if he didn't perform as well as he needed to? What if his best wasn't good enough? These doubts were new to Kwame, who had always been confident in his abilities. But the weight of his dreams and the expectations placed upon him made the stakes feel higher than ever. Kwame tried to push these fears aside, reminding himself that he had always succeeded before and that this time would be no different. In the days leading up to the physics exam, Kwame's routine became almost robotic. Study, review, practice problems, repeat. He barely saw his friends, who were also busy preparing for their exams, and his conversations with his family became shorter and more strained as he grew more consumed by his studies. He could feel the tension building, but he was determined to push through it. Finally, the day of the physics exam arrived. Kwame woke up early, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. His mother prepared his favorite breakfast, a comforting gesture that did little to calm the butterflies in his stomach. His father gave him a reassuring pat on the back and reminded him to stay focused and do his best. Chapter 2: The Fateful Exam. Kwame had always been a top student, so when the day of the physics exam finally arrived, everyone, including his teachers and classmates, expected nothing short of excellence from him. But as he prepared to face the exam, Kwame felt an unfamiliar tension gripping him. He had studied relentlessly for this moment, poring over textbooks, solving past papers, and reviewing every possible concept. Yet, the anxiety gnawing at him felt different, more intense, more foreboding. The morning of the exam was unusually quiet in the Mensa household. Kwame's mother, Afia, noticed her son's unusual silence as he ate his breakfast. She could sense the weight of the expectations he carried, and though she offered words of encouragement, they seemed to bounce off Kwame, who was lost in his thoughts. "Remember, you've prepared well, Kwame. Just do your best," Afia said softly as she handed him a bowl of porridge. Kwame nodded, managing a weak smile, but his mind was already in the exam hall, battling through potential questions. His father, Kofi, gave him a firm, reassuring pat on the back before he left the house. "Don't worry too much, son. You've got this. Just stay calm and focused," Kofi advised. Kwame appreciated the support, but he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The drive to the exam center felt like a blur. He barely noticed the familiar streets of Accra passing by or the usual hustle and bustle of the morning rush hour. All he could think about was the exam paper he would soon face. When he arrived at the exam center, Kwame joined the crowd of students milling around outside, many of them nervously discussing last-minute concepts and potential questions. Kwame kept to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always thrived under pressure, but today felt different. It was as if everything depended on this one exam, as if his entire future hung in the balance. Finally, the doors to the exam hall opened and the students were ushered in. Kwame found his seat and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He closed his eyes, took a few deep breaths, and tried to focus. He knew the material. He had prepared for this. But as the invigilator began to distribute the exam papers, the familiar anxiety returned with a vengeance. When Kwame turned over the exam paper and read through the questions, his heart sank. The questions were not what he had expected. They were more complex, more challenging, and more nuanced than anything he had practiced. Kwame's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the problems in front of him. He felt a cold sweat forming on his forehead as he realized that the answers weren't coming to him as easily as they usually did. He started with the questions he felt most confident about, but even these seemed to take longer than usual. His pen moved more slowly than it should have, his thoughts clouded by the pressure to perform. Time ticked away, each passing minute adding to his anxiety. Kwame glanced at the clock, feeling panic rise in his chest. He was falling behind. Halfway through the exam, Kwame's worst fears began to materialize. He reached a question on electromagnetism, a topic he usually excelled at. But today, his mind went blank. He stared at the problem, willing the answer to come to him, but it was as if the knowledge he had spent years accumulating had suddenly evaporated. His hands trembled as he tried to work through the equations, but nothing seemed to make sense. The more Kwame struggled, the more the pressure mounted. The exam room, usually a place where he felt confident and in control, now felt like a prison. He looked around at his classmates, some of whom seemed to be breezing through the exam. A wave of self-doubt washed over him. How could this be happening? How could everything go so wrong? With time running out, Kwame moved on to the next question, hoping to salvage what he could. But the momentum was gone. His confidence was shattered, and each question seemed more daunting than the last. By the time the invigilator announced that there were only 15 minutes left, Kwame knew he was in trouble. He hadn't answered nearly enough questions to secure the grade he needed, and the ones he had attempted were riddled with uncertainty. In the final moments of the exam, Kwame frantically scribbled answers, hoping against hope that something would stick. But as the invigilator called for the papers to be handed in, Kwame felt a crushing sense of defeat. He hadn't even had time to review his work, let alone complete the exam to the best of his ability. The dream he had nurtured for so long, of becoming an engineer, of following in his father's footsteps, now felt painfully out of reach. When the exam was over, Kwame walked out of the hall in a daze. The other students around him chatted about the questions and compared answers, but Kwame couldn't bring himself to join in. He felt numb, his mind replaying the exam over and over. Each mistake, each missed opportunity, each blank moment etched into his memory. The ride home was silent. Kwame's mother noticed his somber expression as soon as he walked through the door, but she didn't press him for details. She knew her son needed time to process what had happened. That night, Kwame lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fear of failure loomed over him like a dark cloud. He had always been the best, the student everyone looked up to, the one his teachers held up as an example. But now, he faced the very real possibility of falling short, of letting himself and his family down. The weight of his expectations was crushing, and for the first time in his life, Kwame felt powerless to change the outcome. In the days that followed, Kwame tried to put the exam behind him and focus on his remaining subjects. But the anxiety gnawed at him, a constant reminder of what was at stake. He threw himself into his studies with even more intensity, trying to compensate for the physics exam. But the uncertainty lingered, casting a shadow over everything he did. Kwame spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation, with replaying the exam in his mind and second-guessing his answers. Finally, the day came when the exam results were released. Kwame's heart pounded in his chest as he logged into the results portal, his hands shaking as he navigated the site. When the page loaded, Kwame's eyes went straight to his physics grade. He stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The grade was worse than he had feared, a failing mark that shattered his hopes and dreams in an instant. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Kwame processed what he was seeing. The dream of becoming an engineer, the dream that had driven him for so many years, was gone. All the late nights, all the sacrifices, all the plans for the future, they all seemed meaningless now. Kwame felt a wave of despair crash over him, followed by a crushing sense of failure. Kwame's mother found him in his room staring blankly at the screen. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The look on her son's face told her everything she needed to know. She sat beside him, wrapping him in a comforting embrace, but Kwame couldn't bring himself to respond. He was numb, lost in the enormity of what had just happened. Kofi arrived home later that evening, and when he saw the look on his wife's face, he knew something was wrong. When he entered Kwame's room and saw the tear-streaked face of his son, his heart sank. He knew how much this dream had meant to Kwame, and he struggled to find the right words to comfort him. "Kwame," Kofi began, his voice gentle yet firm, "I know this feels like the end of the world right now, but you are more than just a grade. You are strong, you are smart, and you have so much potential. This isn't the end, it's just a detour." But Kwame couldn't see it that way. The weight of his failure was too much to bear. All he could think about was how he had let himself and his family down. The dream that had defined him for so long was gone, and in its place was an overwhelming sense of loss and uncertainty. The future, once so clear and bright, now seemed dark and uncertain. Kwame didn't know where to go from here, but one thing was certain: his life had changed forever. The dream of becoming an engineer, a dream that had defined Kwame's life for as long as he could remember, was shattered. All his plans, hopes, and ambitions were thrown into disarray. For the first time in his life, Kwame didn't know what to do next. Chapter 3. A Family in Shock. The atmosphere in the Mensa household was thick with silence. It had been 2 days since Kwame's exam results were released, and the once lively and bustling home now felt like a shadow of its former self. The news of Kwame's failure in physics had sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the family, leaving them grappling with a mix of emotions they hadn't anticipated. Kwame remained withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone. He spent most of his time in his room, replaying the events of the exam and the moments that had led up to it. The crushing weight of disappointment was like a constant presence, one he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. He felt as though he had let everyone down: his parents, his teachers, his friends, and most of all, himself. Downstairs, Kwame's parents, Kofi and Afia, sat at the dining table in a tense silence. The once warm and inviting space, where the family often gathered to share meals and stories, now felt cold and distant. The news had hit them hard, and they were struggling to come to terms with it. Kofi, who had always been a pillar of strength and composure, was perhaps the most affected. He had seen so much of himself in Kwame: the same curiosity, the same passion for engineering, the same drive to excel. To see his son's dreams crumble in such a way was painful, almost as if he were reliving a failure of his own. As he stared at the untouched plate of food in front of him, Kofi's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Had he put too much pressure on Kwame? Had he pushed him too hard, expecting him to follow in his footsteps without considering what Kwame truly wanted? Kofi had always believed that his son's aspirations aligned with his own, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had been blind to the possibility that Kwame's path might be different. "I just don't understand," Kofi finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "He worked so hard. He was always so good at physics. How could this happen?" Afia, who had been quietly stirring her tea, looked up at her husband with sad eyes. She had always been the emotional anchor of the family, the one who kept everyone grounded. But even she was struggling to find the right words. She knew that Kofi was not just questioning Kwame's failure. He was questioning himself, his role as a father, and whether he had done enough to support his son. "I don't know, Kofi," Afia replied softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Maybe it was just too much for him. The pressure, the expectations, it's a lot for any young person to bear." Kofi sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if trying to ease the tension that had settled there. "I wanted him to succeed so badly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted him to have the opportunities I didn't have when I was his age. But now, I just don't know." Afia reached across the table and placed her hand on Kofi's, her touch a small gesture of comfort in a moment of shared sorrow. "We can't change what's happened," she said gently, "but we can be there for Kwame, support him through this. He's hurting, Kofi. We need to help him find his way again." Kofi nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. He knew Afia was right, but the pain of seeing his son so defeated was difficult to bear. He had always prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could fix anything that was broken, but this was different. This wasn't a machine or a piece of equipment that could be repaired with a few adjustments. This was his son's future, his son's heart, and it was fractured in a way that Kofi couldn't easily mend. Upstairs, Kwame sat on his bed, staring at the physics textbook that lay open in front of him. He hadn't touched it since the day of the exam, but he couldn't bring himself to close it either. It felt like a symbol of everything he had lost, a future he had planned so meticulously, now just out of reach. Kwame's younger siblings, Adwoa and Kofi Jr., were tiptoeing around the house, their usual playful banter replaced by quiet whispers. They were too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but they could sense the tension in the air. They missed the lively conversations at the dinner table, the laughter that used to fill the house, and most of all, they missed their big brother, who now seemed so distant and unreachable. Later that evening, Kofi decided it was time to talk to Kwame. He knew they couldn't avoid the conversation forever, and he wanted to reassure his son that this wasn't the end, that there were still many paths to success, even if they weren't the ones Kwame had originally envisioned. He knocked gently on Kwame's door before opening it. Kwame was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a notebook filled with half-written notes and equations. The sight of his son, who had once been so full of energy and ambition, now looking so lost, tugged at Kofi's heart. "Kwame," Kofi began, his voice calm and steady, "can we talk?" Kwame didn't look up, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging his father's presence. Kofi walked over to the bed and sat down, leaving a space between them. He wanted Kwame to feel that he could speak freely, without pressure. "Son, I know how much this exam meant to you," Kofi said, choosing his words carefully. "And I know how hard you worked. I'm not going to pretend that this isn't a setback, because it is. But I want you to know that it's not the end of the road. You're still an incredibly bright young man with so much potential. Failing one exam doesn't change that." Kwame finally looked up, his eyes filled with frustration and sadness. "But it does, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "I failed the one subject that mattered the most. How can I still become an engineer if I can't even pass physics?" Kofi sighed, understanding the depth of Kwame's despair. He knew there was no easy answer, no simple fix. "Kwame, life doesn't always go the way we plan. Sometimes things happen that we don't expect, and they force us to reconsider our paths. It's okay to be disappointed, but don't let this failure define you. You are more than this one exam." Kwame shook his head, the weight of his father's words conflicting with the weight of his own expectations. "But I don't know what to do now," Kwame admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always wanted to be an engineer. That's who I am. What am I supposed to do if I can't do that?" Kofi leaned forward, trying to catch Kwame's eye. "You are Kwame Mensah," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You are intelligent, determined, and capable of achieving great things. If engineering is truly your passion, there are ways to make it happen, whether it's retaking the exam or exploring other avenues in the field. But if you find that there's another path that interests you, it's okay to pursue that too." Kwame listened, absorbing his father's words, but the path ahead still felt uncertain and fraught with obstacles. The idea of retaking the exam filled him with dread. What if he failed again? And yet, the thought of abandoning his dream entirely felt equally unbearable. "I just don't know," Kwame said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what to do." Kofi placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "Take some time to think about it. Talk to your teachers. Talk to your friends. You have options, Kwame. Whatever you choose, your mother and I will support you. We just want you to be happy and to find a path that makes you feel fulfilled." Kwame nodded slowly, his mind still swirling with doubts and fears. But there was comfort in knowing that his parents were there for him, no matter what. He didn't have to face this alone. As Kofi stood up to leave, he paused at the door. "Kwame," he said, turning back to his son, "remember that this is just one chapter in your life. It's not the whole story. You have the power to write the next chapter, and I know it's going to be a great one." Kwame watched his father leave the room, his words lingering in the air. The road ahead was unclear, and the disappointment of the exam still weighed heavily on his heart. But for the first time since receiving his results, Kwame felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for him that he hadn't yet imagined. Chapter 4: The Pressure to Reconsider. The days following Kwame's conversation with his father were marked by a relentless internal struggle. The pressure to reconsider his future weighed heavily on him, intensifying with each passing moment. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bold red F on his physics results, a constant reminder of his perceived failure. The once clear path of becoming an engineer had vanished, leaving behind a vast, uncharted territory that terrified him. Kwame's friends, who had also chosen the science stream in school, were making plans to study engineering at various universities. Conversations that once filled him with excitement now only deepened his sense of isolation. They talked about applying to top engineering schools, discussing admission requirements, and imagining their lives as future engineers. Kwame, who had always been part of these discussions, now felt like an outsider looking in. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the school's library, pretending to study for an upcoming exam, Kwame overheard two of his friends, Ya and Michael, discussing their university plans. "Which universities are you applying to?" Ya asked, flipping through the pages of a brochure from the University of Ghana. "Legon is my top choice," Michael replied. "They have a great engineering program. I'm also applying to Kenust, just in case." Ya nodded. "Same here. I'm thinking of majoring in civil engineering. What about you, Kwame?" Kwame, caught off guard, looked up from his book, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He had been so quiet lately that his friends hadn't even realized he was there. I'm not sure," Kwame stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm still figuring things out." Michael frowned, sensing something was wrong. "But you were so set on electrical engineering. What happened?" Kwame hesitated, not wanting to explain the whole situation, but he couldn't avoid the truth forever. "I didn't do well in physics," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed." The words hung in the air, heavier than he had expected. Ya and Michael exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and concern. "Kwame, that's tough," Ya said sympathetically. "But you can retake the exam, right? You're one of the smartest people I know. You can bounce back from this." Kwame appreciated his friend's encouragement, but the thought of retaking the exam filled him with dread. The fear of failing again was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure if he could face the disappointment a second time. "Yeah, maybe," Kwame replied noncommittally, hoping to end the conversation. But Michael, ever the pragmatic one, wasn't ready to let it go. "You've got options, Kwame," he said. "There's more to life than engineering. You could look into other fields, something that doesn't rely so heavily on physics." The idea of choosing a different path had been creeping into Kwame's mind ever since he received his results, but admitting it out loud made it feel more real, more final. He nodded, though he still wasn't ready to fully embrace the possibility. "I'm just thinking things over," Kwame said, trying to keep his voice steady. His friends nodded, but Kwame could sense their pity. He didn't want to be pitied. He didn't want to be seen as the guy who couldn't make it in engineering. But deep down, he knew he couldn't continue on this path simply because it was what he had always planned. The fear of another failure was paralyzing, and the pressure to reconsider his future was becoming impossible to ignore. At home, the situation was no different. While his parents tried to support him in every way they could, Kwame could sense their concern. They had always been so proud of his academic achievements, so sure of his bright future as an engineer. Now, they were as lost as he was, trying to navigate this unexpected detour. His mother, Afia, watched him closely, her heart aching for her son. She knew he was struggling, that he felt like his entire world had come crashing down. She wanted to help him find a way forward, but she didn't want to push him too hard or make him feel like he was disappointing them. "Kwame," she said one evening as they sat together in the living room, "you know your father and I love you no matter what, right? We just want you to be happy, to find something you're passionate about." Kwame nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. The love and support of his parents were undeniable, but they couldn't take away the pain of his shattered dream. His father, Kofi, had been doing his own research, trying to find alternatives that might interest Kwame. He had spent hours online, reading about different fields of study, hoping to find something that would spark his son's interest. One evening, Kofi approached Kwame with a folder filled with brochures and printouts. "I've been thinking," he began cautiously. "Maybe it's time to explore other options. There are so many fields out there, Kwame, so many ways to make a difference in the world. What if we looked into something like business management?" Kwame looked at his father in surprise. "Business management?" he repeated, the idea foreign and unexpected. Kofi nodded. "Yes, think about it. Management is a field that's all about problem solving, leadership, and making strategic decisions. Those are skills you already have, Kwame. You're a natural leader, and you've always been good at organizing and planning. Maybe this is a path worth considering." Kwame took the folder from his father and began flipping through the pages. The idea of business management had never crossed his mind before. But as he read through the descriptions of the courses and career opportunities, something began to stir within him. It wasn't the same excitement he had once felt for engineering, but it was something, a spark of curiosity, a faint glimmer of interest. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Kofi continued, sensing his son's hesitation. "But just think about it. Management could open a lot of doors for you, and it's a field that's always in demand. You'd be working with people, leading teams, making important decisions. It could be a very fulfilling career." Kwame didn't know how to respond. The idea was so different from anything he had ever imagined for himself. But as he considered the possibility, he began to see that maybe, just maybe, there was more than one way to succeed. Maybe his future didn't have to be defined by physics, or even by engineering. Maybe there was another path out there, waiting for him to discover it. The pressure to reconsider his future was intense, but it was also liberating in a way Kwame hadn't expected. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of possibility, a small flicker of hope that perhaps his failure wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. As the days passed, Kwame found himself thinking more and more about the idea of studying business management. He wasn't ready to let go of engineering completely, but the fear of failing again weighed heavily on his mind. The thought of finding success in a different field, one where his strengths could still shine, was becoming increasingly appealing. Kwame knew that whatever decision he made, it would be one that would shape the rest of his life. The pressure to reconsider his future was immense, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to redefine himself, to find a new dream, and to prove that success wasn't about following a predetermined path. It was about finding the path that was right for him. And so, with the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders, Kwame began to explore the possibility of a different future, one that, while not what he had originally envisioned, might just lead him to a success beyond anything he had ever imagined. Chapter 5: A New Path Emerges. The decision to explore new possibilities wasn't easy for Kwame, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that clinging to his failed dream would only hold him back. It was time to open his mind to other options, even if it meant stepping into unfamiliar territory. The idea of pursuing business management, which had been gently suggested by his father, slowly began to take root. Kwame spent the next few days researching business management programs at various universities in Ghana. He read about the subjects, the career prospects, and the skills he would gain. The more he learned, the more he realized that management wasn't just about numbers and corporate jargon. It was about leadership, strategy, and the ability to solve complex problems, much like engineering, but in a different context. At first, Kwame approached the idea with caution. His heart was still tethered to the idea of becoming an engineer, but as he delved deeper into the world of management, something began to shift. He started to see parallels between engineering and management that he hadn't noticed before. Both required analytical thinking, problem-solving, and a methodical approach to challenges. Perhaps, Kwame thought, he could still use the skills he had honed in science and apply them in this new field. One evening, after a long day of researching different programs, Kwame called a family meeting. His parents and younger siblings gathered in the living room, sensing that something important was about to be discussed. "I've been thinking a lot," Kwame began, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of the decision he was about to make. "I know that I've always wanted to be an engineer, and that's what I've worked towards for so long. But after everything that's happened, I've realized that maybe it's time to consider a different path." Kofi and Afia exchanged a glance, both sitting on the edge of their seats, waiting for Kwame to continue. Adwoa and Kofi Jr. sat quietly, their eyes wide with curiosity. "I've been looking into business management," Kwame said, trying to gauge his family's reaction. "At first, it didn't seem like something I'd be interested in, but the more I read about it, the more I realize that it's not so different from what I've always loved. It's about solving problems, leading people, and making things work better. And I think it might be something I could be good at." Afia's eyes softened with understanding, and she smiled gently at her son. "Kwame, Whatever path you choose, we're here to support you. You have so much talent and potential, and I'm sure you'll succeed in whatever you put your mind to. Kofi nodded in agreement, pride evident in his expression. I'm glad you're keeping an open mind, Kwame. Management is a field that offers a lot of opportunities, and you have the right qualities to excel in it. If this is the path you want to take, then we'll do everything we can to help you succeed. Kwame felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been so worried about disappointing his family, but their unwavering support made him realize that this new path could be just as fulfilling as the one he had originally envisioned. But what about engineering? Adwa asked innocently, her young mind still holding on to the image of her big brother as a future engineer. Kwame smiled at his sister, his heart warming at her question. Engineering will always be a part of who I am, he explained, but sometimes life takes us in unexpected directions. I'm still going to work hard and make something of myself. It just might look a little different from what we all imagined. The family spent the rest of the evening discussing Kwame's plans. They talked about the different universities offering business management programs, the career opportunities that could follow, and how Kwame could use his analytical skills in a new way. It was a conversation filled with hope and possibility, and for the first time in weeks, Kwame felt a genuine sense of excitement about the future. The next day, Kwame visited his school counselor to discuss his decision. The counselor, Mr. Appiah, had known Kwame for years and was aware of the setback he had faced with his physics exam. When Kwame explained his interest in business management, Mr. Appiah nodded thoughtfully. You know, Kwame, Mr. Appiah said, leaning back in his chair, you've always been a strong student, not just in science, but across the board. Management could be a great fit for you. It's a field where you can really make an impact, and your skills in problem-solving and leadership will serve you well. Kwame felt reassured by his counselor's words. They spent the rest of the meeting going over potential universities, application deadlines, and the steps Kwame needed to take to transition from a science-focused track to a business one. It was a daunting task, but with each step, Kwame felt more certain that this was the right move for him. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Kwame focused on completing his remaining exams while simultaneously preparing his applications for business management programs. It was a balancing act, but Kwame was determined to give it his all. He knew that this was his chance to redefine his future, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Finally, the day came when Kwame received his acceptance letters. He had applied to several universities, but there was one in particular that he had set his sights on, the University of Ghana, Legon. It was one of the top universities in the country, known for its rigorous academic programs and vibrant campus life. When the letter arrived, Kwame's hands shook as he tore it open, his heart pounding in his chest. Dear Mr. Mensah, the letter began, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Bachelor of Science in Business Administration program at the University of Ghana, Legon. Congratulations on this achievement, and we look forward to welcoming you to our campus. Kwame's eyes filled with tears of relief and joy as he read the words. He had done it. He had found a new path, and it was one that promised a future full of opportunities. He rushed downstairs to share the news with his family, who greeted him with cheers and hugs. That evening, as Kwame sat outside on the porch watching the sunset over the city of Accra, he felt a deep sense of peace. His journey had taken an unexpected turn, but it was one that had led him to a place where he could thrive. He had learned that success wasn't about rigidly following a predetermined plan. It was about adapting to change, finding new strengths, and forging a path that was uniquely his own. As Kwame prepared to embark on this new chapter of his life, he knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. He had faced failure, disappointment, and doubt, and he had come out stronger on the other side. Now, with a new path emerging before him, Kwame felt confident that he could achieve great things, no matter where life took him. Chapter 6. The Decision to Pivot. Kwame's acceptance into the University of Ghana's Business Administration program was a turning point. But the decision to fully embrace this new path still weighed heavily on his mind. He had taken the first steps towards a new future, but doubts lingered in the shadows. As the days passed and the start of the semester approached, Kwame knew that he needed to commit to this new direction wholeheartedly. Yet, part of him still clung to the remnants of his engineering dream. The day after receiving his acceptance letter, Kwame decided to visit his old secondary school. He needed closure, a final goodbye to the dream he had nurtured for so long. The school grounds were quiet, with only a few students and teachers milling about. The physics lab, once his sanctuary, and the place where he had spent countless hours studying and experimenting, now felt distant, a relic of a life he was leaving behind. As he walked through the halls, Kwame bumped into Mr. Owusu, his former physics teacher. The older man greeted him with a warm smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. Mr. Owusu had always been supportive of Kwame's ambitions, recognizing his potential early on and pushing him to excel. Seeing his favorite student back on campus, but under such different circumstances, stirred mixed emotions. "Kwame, it's good to see you," Mr. Owusu said, extending a hand. "How have you been?" Kwame hesitated, unsure how to begin. He had always respected Mr. Owusu, and the thought of disappointing him weighed heavily on his heart. "I'm doing okay, sir," Kwame replied, shaking his teacher's hand. "I've been accepted into the business administration program at the University of Ghana." Mr. Owusu's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise, but he quickly masked it with a nod of approval. "That's wonderful news, Kwame. Congratulations." "Thank you, sir," Kwame said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Mr. Owusu studied Kwame for a moment, sensing the conflict within him. "I know this isn't the path you originally planned," he said gently, "but life has a way of leading us where we're meant to go, even if it's not what we expected." Kwame nodded, grateful for the understanding. "It's just hard to let go," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I wanted to be an engineer for so long. It's hard to imagine doing anything else." Mr. Owusu smiled kindly, a gesture that conveyed both wisdom and compassion. "Kwame, dreams are important, but they're also fluid. They can change and evolve as we grow. What's important is that you find something you're passionate about, something that makes you want to get up every morning and give it your all. Whether it's engineering, business, or something else entirely, what matters is that you're moving forward." Kwame considered his teacher's words, realizing that Mr. Owusu was right. He had spent so much time mourning the loss of his engineering dream that he hadn't fully opened himself to the possibilities that lay ahead. Perhaps it was time to let go of the past and embrace the future with the same passion and determination he had once reserved for engineering. Before leaving, Kwame took one last look around the physics lab. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, acknowledging the dreams and aspirations that had once filled this room. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked out, leaving behind the remnants of a dream that no longer served him. As he exited the school, Kwame felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what could have been, but relief that he was finally allowing himself to move on. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his path, and he was ready to walk it. When he returned home, Kwame found his mother in the kitchen preparing dinner. The comforting aroma of her cooking filled the air, and for the first time in a while, Kwame felt at ease. He joined her at the counter, chopping vegetables as they talked. "Mom," Kwame began, his voice steady, "I went to the school today. I needed to say goodbye to some things." Afia glanced at her son, sensing that something had shifted within him. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, her tone gentle. Kwame paused, thinking carefully before responding. "It was hard," he admitted, "but it also made me realize that holding on to that dream was holding me back. I've decided to focus on business management, and I'm ready to give it everything I've got." Afia smiled warmly, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad to hear that, Kwame. Your father and I are so proud of you, not just for what you've achieved, but for your strength in facing this change head-on." As they continued to prepare dinner, Kwame felt a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time since receiving his exam results, he felt like he was in control of his future. The decision to pivot from engineering to business management wasn't just a choice. It was a commitment to himself, to his growth, and to the possibilities that awaited him. The following weeks were a blur of preparations for university. Kwame immersed himself in reading about business theories, management strategies, and leadership principles. He wanted to hit the ground running when classes began, and the more he studied, the more he realized how much he had to learn. It was daunting, but also exhilarating. On the day he was due to move into his dormitory at the University of Ghana, Kwame's family gathered to see him off. They packed the car with his belongings, and the drive to the university was filled with a mix of excitement and nerves. As they arrived on campus, Kwame was struck by the energy of the place. The bustling students, the grand buildings, the sense of purpose that seemed to permeate the air. Kwame's parents helped him carry his things to his dorm room, where he would be sharing the space with another business student. The room was small but cozy, and as they unpacked, Kwame felt a mix of emotions. This was the beginning of a new chapter, and while he was ready to embrace it, he couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for the life he had once imagined. After everything was settled, Kofi pulled Kwame aside for a private word. "Kwame," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've faced a lot of challenges, and you've handled them with grace and determination. I have no doubt that you're going to do great things here." Kwame nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. "Thank you, Dad. I'm going to give it my best." Kofi smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "That's all I've ever wanted for you, Kwame, to see you find your own path and succeed in your own way." As his family left the campus, Kwame stood in the doorway of his dorm room, watching them drive away. He took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was it, the start of something new, something entirely his own. He was no longer the boy who had failed physics. He was Kwame Mensah, a student of business management, and he was ready to make his mark. The next day, classes began, and Kwame quickly found himself immersed in a world that was both familiar and new. The analytical skills he had developed during his time studying science served him well in his business courses. But there was so much more to learn about leadership, economics, organizational behavior, and strategic thinking. It was challenging, but Kwame relished the opportunity to grow and expand his horizons. As the weeks turned into months, Kwame's confidence grew. He discovered a passion for management that he hadn't anticipated, and his professors began to take notice of his potential. He excelled in group projects, often taking on leadership roles and guiding his peers through complex assignments. The qualities that had once made him a promising engineer, his problem-solving abilities, his attention to detail, his drive to succeed, were now helping him to thrive in the world of business. Kwame also began to build a network of friends and mentors within the university. He joined the business club, where he participated in case competitions and workshops that honed his skills and broadened his understanding of the industry. For the first time in a long time, Kwame felt a deep sense of purpose and belonging. The decision to pivot from engineering to business management had not been easy, but as Kwame reflected on his journey, he realized that it had been the right one. He had faced adversity, but he had also discovered a new passion, one that filled him with excitement and possibility. He was no longer defined by his past, but by the future he was creating for himself. Kwame's journey was far from over, but he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them.